Hello Year 9, welcome to your history lesson. It's Mr. Sandbrook here. I'm going to be teaching you today. This is the 8th lesson in our unit of work on the Western Front. And today we're going to look at the sources that historians use to find out about the Western Front. This is really important stuff to get ready for the final exam. So let's see what we can do. As usual guys, before we start, get ready for our lesson. So grab your history workbook and a pen, some paper to use, and make sure that you've got no distractions around you. Just press pause and make sure you're completely set up for today's lesson. Okay, so here's our Do Now quiz. What I'd like you to do is to put the different stages of the evacuation route that you can see here in order from start to finish. So go from the moment of injury to the moment of most care. Just press pause and see what you can do. Okay, so here's what you were after. We were going from stretcher bearers all the way down to the base hospital. If you need to change anything in your workbook, do that now. Give yourself a mark out of 5, and then we can move on to our lesson. So today's lesson is all about the different sources of evidence that historians use to find out about the Western Front. So we're going to get to know what those different sources of evidence are. Then we're going to evaluate those sources, and then we're going to apply them to historical inquiries. Now all of these things are going to be really useful for us in our final exam. So let's have a look at our knowledge organ. Start. You've got one area to have a look at. Look down in the bottom left corner where I've highlighted, and you can see we've got sources of evidence there. We're going to cover all of those today. So here's our starter. We're going to start with some source work because that's what our lesson is focusing on today. Have a read through this extract of a nurse's diary. What I'd like you to think about is how typical this diary entry would be. She describes a really busy hospital. Do you think it would be this busy all the time? I'll give you a hint in a moment. If you don't want to hear that and want to have a go by yourself, just press pause now. Okay, so let's look specifically when this source was made. It was made in the early days of the Battle of the Somme. Now think back and use your contextual knowledge. You might know that the Battle of the Somme had been the biggest offensive that the British Army held in the First World War up to that point. So that might affect the amount of wounded people that the nurse had to deal with. So just hit pause now and write your answers in the space in your workbook. So here's the answer. No, it wouldn't have been that busy all the time. This would not be a typical day in a base hospital. Why? Well, because the Battle of the Somme had been planned for months in advance. They'd have got ready for this. You might also know that in the week leading up to the battle, there was a huge bombardment of the German positions by British artillery. So the British Army suffered only a few injuries in that week. The base hospitals would have been fairly quiet. And then there was that huge increase in casualties after the first day. We looked at tens of thousands of casualties happening. And you also know maybe that the battle then went on for months afterwards. Not to the same level of intensity though. So if you put all that together, the terrible things that Sister Appleton writes about wouldn't have been a typical day at a base hospital for most of the First World War. And this is a key idea for us when we evaluate a piece of evidence. We really do well to think about how typical the evidence is that we're encountering as a historian. So we're going to cover some new content now. I'll explain things in quite some detail. You might like to press pause at the end of this slide and make a few extra notes, maybe in your workbook or on some spare paper. So we need to know about the different sorts of evidence that are available to us as historians of the First World War. We need to get to know the different types of contemporary source that we can use. These are sources from the time of the war itself. So we might firstly use army service records for individual soldiers. They might be quite useful to us as a historian, where we can have a look at what happened to a soldier in outline over the course of the war. But they only give us really limited detail. So they don't give us a broad view. We would need to be careful with just one soldier's service record if we were going to get a typical picture. Secondly, we might use newspaper reports, which of course report in more detail and give a good broad picture at a certain point in the war. But again, we need to be a little bit careful because newspapers were used to try to keep public spirits up, to try to keep morale up. And of course, they only give us a report on one day of the war. Thirdly, we could use medical articles by doctors. Doctors often wrote up their latest discoveries or techniques that they were using, sharing their knowledge across the medical community. But we might need to be a little bit careful because the treatments that the doctors detail might not have actually transferred well in real life. And of course, we can't use a doctor's report if we wanted to know how a soldier was feeling or what a soldier was experiencing. There'd be other sources to use. And a source that we might use might be our fourth one, the diaries or personal accounts or testimonies of the soldiers or nurses or doctors on the Western Front themselves. Now these are great for giving us a personal, detailed view of things that were happening, often lasting for longer than one day. But again, there are limitations here. We need to be careful that one soldier's experiences were typical, and we also need to remind ourselves that soldiers and nurses couldn't be completely honest. They knew that their letters home were checked by the army censors. If they wrote too many details that would be a risk of security, they'd have a risk of their letter not making it home at all. And so many people left out the worst details of what they were experiencing. We can also use photographs. We're at a time in history where photographic evidence is available to us. And of course, these would be great for giving us a snapshot of a certain time and place on the Western Front. But again, be careful because some photographs were staged for propaganda purposes, again to raise morale of the public at home. So we need to be careful if they provide us with a typical picture or a picture that's accurate at all. And lastly, we can use hospital records. Hospitals kept a record of the quantity of operations that they were doing and the types of wounds that they were treating. They recorded mortality rates so you could see how successful treatments were. But again, this evidence has its limits. It doesn't tell us about the experiences of individuals. And we also need to be careful about typicality. So we've got lots of different sources that are available to us. It would really help you to know these off by heart. So what you might want to do is to make a little poster or a series of post-it notes to stick up on your wall to remind yourself of these so you can use them in your final exam. Now that's a lot of information there. I've come to the end of this slide. If you want to pause at this point and read through carefully, now's a good moment to do so. So let's have a look at some of these types of source in action. Firstly, a diary. Now source A, we've already looked at this, is our diary of a nurse operating in a base hospital, and she describes here the early days of the Battle of the Somme. And you can see how a diary can bring history to life. The details that you've got here allow you to really understand the terrible conditions of this base hospital in 1916. Maybe highlight for you in your workbook what you think the standout piece of information is. Just pause for a moment and I'll do one too. So here's the bit that I highlighted. I've gone for the sentence, "We dealt with large numbers of horribly bad wounds." For me, this is the essence of Sister Appleton's entry. Okay, our next type of source in source B is the Army service records of an individual soldier. The image you can see on the screen is an example of a service record. So you can see these will just be short, to the point entries about important things that had happened to a soldier. And our example is from one soldier's service record. I've taken just 6 of his more relevant entries. Just see if you can, again, highlight one of them, one that you think might be particularly important if we're thinking about medicine or medical care on the trenches. What stands out to you? So I've gone for the entry of the 16th of April 1918, and when you can see that we've got an entry there for NYDN mild. Now with my contextual knowledge as a historian, I know that NYDN is not yet diagnosed nervous. That, remember, is shell shock. So our soldier had a mild case of shell shock at this time. Here's our next example. Now photographs did emerge from the Western Front. Lots of the photos were staged though. They were used for propaganda purposes at home. Now when you come across a photograph from the Western Front, you can do much the same as you did with your written sources, and you can think about what stands out to you in the content of the photograph. So you can make direct notes onto the image itself. Again, pause for a moment and see if there's anything in this image of stretcher bearers that stands out to you. So here's what I got. I've noticed that there's lots of stretcher bearers. We've got 7 of them helping just one wounded soldier. Everywhere seems to be covered in mud, so much so that one of our stretcher bearers has sunk down to his knees. The terrain is interesting. I can see shell holes, and I put all that together along with the date that I've got from the caption of 1917, and that makes me think possibly this is a scene from the battlefields of Ypres. Here's our last example, and here's an example of a medical example, a report by a doctor. So this comes from a report on gas gangrene from an important doctor from the consulting surgeon to the British Army. Again, which part of this might you highlight as being some standout information? Just pause for a moment or so. I went for this. likely to occur if muddy clothing or earth has been carried in. Again, my contextual knowledge leads me to this key piece of information as being the thing that gas gangrene was caused by. And that's the part of the source that I might use in an inquiry. So you're nearly ready for your main activity. Make sure that you've read through all of the reading material and you've looked at the sources carefully. And here's what I'd like you to do. Some keywords, and then what I'd like you to do is to use your examples of the sources to summarize them and then give a summary quote from each one. I've given you an example in source A to show you what I mean. And then in the second column, simply lift a sentence or some words to try to sum the source up. For your photograph, you're not going to be able to quote, so you're just going to describe content. And then after that, what I'd like you to do is to see if you can pick a source that you would use for those inquiries that you can see underneath the table. Which source do you think would be the most use to you? And then explain your choice for just one of them. So you could take this a bit further. There's loads of sources on the internet from the First World War. The National Archives has got a really nice exercise where you can see a range of sources which link to just one soldier, and you can trace his experiences through the First World War. And this is great experience for you as a historian to get your hands on some genuine historical sources. So have a little look at the National Archives website. Okay, well done Year 9, we've come to the end of the lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next lesson.